I'm going to introduce the next speaker, Stephen Guinea, one of my heroes actually, guy that got me sort of into the paleo fold, talking about obesity, solutions for a new problem. Warm round of applause.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Thank you all for coming. So let's get started. Why don't we start by defining obesity? Obesity is the accumulation of excess body fat. So how do we measure it? The most accurate way of measuring it is to directly determine the percentage of body fat, and some commonly used cutoffs for obesity in men and women are greater than 25% for men and greater than 33% for women. But there are other more indirect, less accurate but still useful ways of measuring obesity, such as the body mass index, which is calculated based on height and weight measurements. And body mass index greater than 25 indicates overweight, and over 30 indicates obesity. And another way that we can measure is using skin fold thickness. So if you pinch your skin, the thickness is a rough measure of the amount of fat under your skin, your subcutaneous fat. So this is the structure of the talk. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of obesity. Then I'm going to talk about a system that is sometimes called the Adipostat. Then I'm going to talk about the role of palatability and reward in obesity. Then I'm going to talk about, in the context of this discussion, some changes that have occurred in the American diet over the last 200 years. And then I'm going to talk about what we can do about all this. First, I'd like to introduce you to what Barnum and Bailey Circus referred to as the world's fattest man in 1890, the human freight car, Chauncey Moreland. Chauncey Moreland was a sideshow act of Barnum and Bailey Circus in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This is another picture of him later on in life, and although he's clearly very obese, he's perhaps not as remarkable today as he was back then. Obesity used to be a disorder that was reserved almost exclusively for the affluent, and it goes back a long time. So scientists have analyzed the mummy of Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt, who ruled around 1490 BC, and determined that not only was she obese, but she likely suffered from diabetes, and that may have been what killed her. Likewise, King Henry VIII of England, at the time of his death, was reputed to have a 54-inch waist, and also showed signs of diabetes. A more recent example is President William Howard Taft, who was widely ridiculed for his obesity at the time of his presidency. And the reason was that at the time, obesity was not very common. Now, how do we know that? Well, fortunately, we have statistics for Caucasian males from 1892, and we can compare those to the same demographic currently and see what the trend has been. So, if we look at those figures, what we see is that in the 40 to 49 year age group, in 1892, the prevalence of obesity was approximately 3.7%, whereas in the year 2000, it was about 24.4%. And if we look in the 50 to 59 year age group, the change is even more pronounced. And you can see that around 1980, there was this sort of inflection point where the rate increased dramatically, and that's what we refer to as the modern obesity epidemic. And if we take these data and look at them in a bit of a different way, in 1892, going from age 40 to age 69, the obesity prevalence was low and remained relatively stable. Whereas if we look in the year 2000, at age 40 to 49, it began high, and then by 60 to 69, the prevalence was even higher. So this is what's typical of current affluent populations. They gain body fat gradually with age. But that's not the historical precedent. So now I'd like to talk about a system called the Adipostat. Adipo means fat, and stat means the same. This is the system in the body that regulates body fatness. So during World War II, a man by the name of Ancel Keys, that some of you may have heard of, did an experiment to model human starvation in conscientious objectors. And so what he did was he put adult males on a reduced calorie diet consisting of 1,570 calories a day on average mostly from bread and sweet potatoes with some vegetables. And after 24 weeks, this is a graph here of body mass and fat mass. After 24 weeks, they had lost approximately 70% of their initial body fat mass. But for our purposes, what's really interesting is that after they were allowed to return to their normal diet, their fat mass rebounded. And in fact, it overshot at 33 weeks, the initial value here. And by 58 weeks, it had returned to a level that was almost identical to the starting level. So their bodies essentially defended against a decrease in body fat mass. So how about an increase in fat mass? Well, this is one of my favorite of the numerous overfeeding studies that have been done in humans. In this experiment, both lean and overweight people were overfed by an excess of 50% of their normal calorie intake for 6 weeks. During the course of those 6 weeks, they gained over 9 pounds of fat mass, and then they were followed when they returned to their normal diet. So after 6 weeks after having returned to their normal diet, these people had lost more than 7 of the excess 9 pounds that they had gained in fat mass. So fat mass is not only defended against negative changes, it's defended against positive changes, both in lean and overweight individuals. So how does this work? Well, it's been known since the 1950s that the brain plays a very important role in body fat mass regulation. So back then what they did was they made lesions to a bunch of different parts of the brain, and they determined that by making lesions in specific parts of the brain, within a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, they could produce either morbid obesity or extreme anorexia. And by the 1980s, it was known that there was a circulating factor that was communicating information from fat tissue to the brain, and that was involved in controlling body fatness. So in 1994, Jeffrey Friedman's group discovered what the circulating factor was and called it leptin. So essentially how the system works is leptin is produced in proportion to fat mass. It then is sensed by the hypothalamus and certain other parts of the brain, and then feeds back in a classic negative feedback loop, which maintains body fatness within a certain range, sometimes referred to as a set point. So when leptin was initially discovered, the pharmaceutical industry was preparing for an absolute bonanza because they thought they might have a cure for common obesity. And so they did some trials. What they did was they took a group of obese people, gave them leptin injections, fairly large doses, and at the end of the trial, they were still obese. So they lost some fat mass, but not enough to bring them back to the lean level. And what they discovered is that actually obese people have a lot of leptin. They have a lot more leptin than a lean person, in fact. So how does this work? If leptin acts to constrain fat mass by this negative feedback loop, how is it that obese people can have more leptin than lean people? Well, the current model is that there's a degree of leptin resistance that develops in the brain. So the brain's not hearing this leptin signal as well. So what happens at that point, the brain thinks it's starving essentially, and it activates a starvation program, which involves increasing food intake, decreasing energy expenditure, and accumulating fat in fat mass. So at that point, the fat accumulation continues until leptin has been increased to the point where it overcomes that resistance in the brain. And at that point, the person has reached a new homeostatic set point at which body fatness and leptin are essentially stable at a new level, a new higher level. So what's increasing the set point? That's the big question. I'm going to talk about one factor that I think plays a role, food palatability and reward. But before we get into that, I want to show you one graph that explains very simply why there's an obesity epidemic in the United States. This is a graph of our calorie intake between 1970 and 2009. It's increased by an average of 425 calories per day. Percentage-wise, that's a 20% increase. Now, the magnitude of that estimate varies by study, but it's generally considered to be somewhere between 250 and 570 excess calories, which is a tremendous increase. There's no doubt in my mind that this is the reason for the obesity epidemic, but it doesn't really help us that much, unfortunately, because it doesn't explain why we're eating more calories. So that's what I think is really important to get at. Why are we eating more calories? So to answer that question, let's go back to 1976. This is just around the beginning of the obesity epidemic, and researchers are looking for a way to model human obesity in animals. And so they try all these different diets. They're feeding them high-fat diets with animal fat, with vegetable fat, with hydrogenated fat. They're feeding them high-sugar diets. They're manipulating micronutrient levels. And some of these diets are working to some degree, but there's a lot of variability, and many of them are taking a long time to produce obesity. So a researcher named Anthony Sclafani decided to try something new in 1976. The idea is very simple. He went to the grocery store and bought a variety of highly palatable human foods and put them in the cage along with the regular rodent chow. So these foods included things like condensed sweetened milk, chocolate, marshmallows, cookies, salami, banana, and peanut butter. And what these rats did was they immediately began to ignore their regular rodent chow and began gorging on these highly palatable human foods. And immediately they gained weight and became obese very rapidly. So they concluded feeding rats a variety of highly palatable supermarket foods was found to be a particularly effective way of producing dietary obesity in rats. And so the macronutrient composition, the micronutrient composition of this diet cannot fully explain its ability to produce obesity, because diets that manipulate those factors don't produce the same amount of obesity. So there really appears to be something with the palatability itself and the reward involved, which I'll get to in a minute. So this diet was later named the Cafeteria Diet, and it's been used as a model of obesity ever since then. It continues to be essentially the most effective solid food diet for producing dietary obesity in rodents. The rodents really like this diet. They like it so much that they will endure extreme cold temperatures and foot shocks to obtain it when regular rodent chow is freely available without having to go through all those things. And so this brings us to the next concept, and that is food reward. Food reward is the process by which behaviors are reinforced in response to food consumption. So for example, if you have a new food that you've never eaten before, and your brain likes that food, it will cause all the cues associated with that food to become more pleasant over time. So, for example, flavor, texture, color, you'll appreciate that food more over time, and that's how we develop a taste for things that we initially don't like. And so what are the factors that the brain uses to determine if it's gonna, and by the way, that drives food seeking and food consumption behaviors. So what are the ways that the brain decides that a food is rewarding and that it wants to reinforce the acquisition and consumption of this food? Well, some of the factors that are either known or suspected include calorie density, fat, starch, sugar, salt, free glutamate such as monosodium glutamate, an absence of bitter flavors, certain textures, a variety of different foods in the diet, certain aromas, and a consistency of flavor. That is, individual foods taste the same each time. And if you look at this list, this is essentially a playbook for processed food manufacture. And it's also a playbook for professional chefs. So what happens when you remove these factors from the diet? Let's go back to 1965 for a very unusual study. It was a study where they fed subjects a bland liquid diet in a hospitalized setting. So this is a setting where they had no other food options. This is the only thing they had access to. Here's a close-up of this apparatus here. It's essentially a straw with a button on it, and every time you press the button, you get 7.4 mils of this formula. But the subjects had no way to know how much they were consuming other than how many mouthfuls they were getting from pressing this button. So they were told to consume as much of this formula as they needed to feel satisfied. They said the feeding system described attempts to reduce the eating process to its simplest components. The diet is a bland liquid formula and the manner of obtaining it is devoid of all sociability. And just if any of you are curious, the macronutrient breakdown was 50% carbohydrate, 30% fat, and 20% sugar. Or, excuse me, protein. That doesn't make sense. Okay, so first they tested this in lean people. So they had 2 lean individuals that they put on this extremely bland diet. Both of them ate a normal amount of calories and maintained their weight perfectly over a course of 16 and 10 days respectively. Next, they tried this in a grossly obese individual who started off at 400 pounds. And immediately upon being placed on this diet, he dramatically reduced his calorie intake, and over the course of the next 255 days, averaged less than 500 calories a day of this liquid formula. Again, he was not deliberately reducing calorie intake. He was asked to eat as much as he needed to feel satisfied. So this is his weight curve up here, and this is his calorie intake. Sorry it's so small, they're very large graphs. So after 255 days, this individual had lost 200 pounds. And the investigators stated, during all this time, weight was steadily lost, and he never complained of hunger or gastrointestinal discomfort, which is pretty extraordinary considering he was eating a truly starvation level diet. So let's look at someone else. This was a woman who initially weighed 393 pounds, was put on the same diet. Over the course of 23 days, she averaged 144 calories per day of this bland liquid diet. And over the course of that time, lost 23 pounds. They tried this in 3 additional obese subjects, and all of them showed a similar inhibition of calorie intake when fed by this machine. So what's going on here? Well, to begin to answer that question, let's go to a study conducted by an investigator named Michel Cabanach in 1971. This was published in the journal Nature in 1971. He was trying to answer the question, do humans have a set point for body weight regulation? And so he used this method where he gave people tastes of a highly palatable sweetened solution of increasing concentration and had them rate the pleasantness of that solution. And then he gave them a 50-gram glucose load. And then he did the same thing afterwards, had them rate these solutions. So what he was looking at is the difference between the before and after pleasantness ratings. So this is a graph here of what these types of things look like. On the top, this is the pleasantness rating here for the vertical axis. Horizontal axis is increasing concentrations of the solution. More concentrated solutions were rated as more pleasant. After the glucose load, they were less pleasant than they were before. So what he did was he put these people on a reduced calorie diet. Now they were eating their normal type of food, but just had them reduce their calorie intake. Their weight dropped by 3.1 kilos over the course of 2 or 2.5 weeks. And he repeated this afterwards. This is basically a way to measure how full you get after you eat food, which is an indirect measure of whether you're at your set point or not. So what he showed was that after this weight loss by calorie restriction, there was no difference in the before and after rating curves. Essentially, a simple way of putting that is that they weren't getting full from the same amount of food. So he concluded in this study that there was a set point for human body weight regulation. But the most interesting thing was in a follow-up study that he did in 1976. Now in this study, instead of causing weight loss by restricting calories, he used a bland liquid diet similar to the previous study. So at the beginning of the study, this is the same type of experiments. The curves look very similar. This is the beginning. And he had them on this diet, and they lost, I misquoted the number for the previous experiment. They lost 2.7. In this study, they lost 3.1 kilos over a similar period of time, reduced their calorie intake by a similar amount, except the difference was this time they were not deliberately reducing calorie intake. Their calorie intake spontaneously decreased despite the fact that they were not attempting to decrease it. So this is similar to the previous results. And these people started off somewhat overweight, by the way. That's an important detail. So what happened after this diet? Well, you see that the curve didn't change very much. There's still quite a big change in the pleasantness ratings from before to after. So a little anecdote that I think illustrates these results. In the present experiment, the subjects reduced their calorie intake voluntarily, present experiment being the bland liquid diet experiment, and were always in good spirits, while in the previous experiments, the subjects had to continually fight off their hunger and would spend the night dreaming of food. Food that is either palatability enriched or impoverished may act to raise or lower the set point for body weight regulation. So now let's apply this concept to some popular weight loss diets. Let's start with the low-fat diet. In this study, female participants were asked to reduce their fat intake, which they did by greater than 50% of their normal intake. They maintained that out to 2 years, and they were not asked to reduce their calorie intake at all, yet spontaneously their calorie intake decreased by over 400 calories per day, and that was maintained for 2 years. And as one might expect, their body weight decreased and was still decreased to some extent by 2 years. So the most comparable low-carbohydrate study I could find that also went out to 2 years and was not deliberately restricted in calories, they asked the people to reduce their carbohydrate. They were mostly men. They reduced it by approximately 50%, maintained that for 2 years. Again, calorie intake spontaneously dropped without asking the participants to restrict their calorie intake, and weight decreased and remained decreased at 2 months. So, 2 things I want to point out here. The first is the degree of weight loss was greater in the low-carbohydrate diet, but the second one is that qualitatively, these results are extraordinarily similar to one another. And to illustrate that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip back and forth between these 2 slides a couple of times so that you can see just how similar these graphs are. So low carbohydrate, low fat, low carbohydrate. So let's turn the clock back even further and put this in the perspective of non-industrial diets. Let's start with the San of Botswana. They live in the Kalahari Desert. They're hunter-gatherers, and they eat predominantly a diet composed of nuts, starchy tubers, fruit, assorted leaves, insects, and a variety of large and small game. Their cooking is very simple, consisting of roasting, boiling, or drying their food. They use no salt, no spices. Very simple diet. And it's dominated by a single food source, the Mongongo nut. So in peak Mongongo season, they're getting about 58% of their calories from this single food source. And their overall yearly calorie intake breakdown is roughly 60% fat, 25% carbohydrate, 15% protein. So it's somewhat monotonous, very simple diet. So how fat are these people? This is a graph of their body mass index versus age. You can see that both men and women remain very lean throughout their lives. Peak body mass index occurs around peak reproductive times and then declines thereafter. Just to give you a frame of reference, 25 is the cutoff for overweight, 30 is the cutoff for obese. So these people are very lean. Now let's consider a highland village in Papua New Guinea that was extensively studied in the 1960s and 1970s at Tukisenta. These people eat almost nothing but sweet potatoes. They're cooked gently in earth ovens, and they also have smaller contributions from taro and sugarcane and a couple of other things. Almost exclusively sweet potatoes. They also, from time to time, have feasts during which they eat a large amount of pork, but that's a relatively small contribution to the overall diet. And although the investigators didn't specifically report this, many cultures throughout New Guinea are known to eat a variety of insects, particularly in childhood. So if we look at their macronutrient breakdown, the day-to-day macronutrient intake was extraordinarily biased toward carbohydrate at 94.6%, very low in protein, very low in fat. So this is their day-to-day macronutrient intake. It probably would be a bit different if they included the feast days with the pork, etc. But any way you slice it, it's extraordinarily biased towards carbohydrate and away from protein and fat. And their diet was also moderately high in fiber. So how fat were these people? This is a graph that shows percent of standard weight based on actuarial tables from the 1950s United States. So during peak reproductive years, they had fairly similar weights to Americans in the 1950s, but they declined thereafter. And if we look at skin fold thicknesses, this is the sum of 3 skin fold thicknesses. So again, this is a pinch of the skin that measures subcutaneous fat. In men, the measurement is quite low and remains low throughout life. And in women, it starts off relatively low and peaks at peak reproductive years again and declines until by the time they're elderly, it's comparable to the level of men. So these people are lean throughout their lives. The subjects were shorter and lighter than Europeans, muscular and mostly very lean. By contrast with European populations, the skin fold thicknesses in these subjects are small and do not increase with advancing age. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the changes that have happened in the US diet and the relevance to these concepts. This is a graph here of percent of total food spending spent on food eaten away from home and food eaten at home from 1889 to 2009 in the United States. What we can see is that in 1889, 93% of the food that we ate, or that we purchased, was eaten at home. Whereas in 2009, only 51% of it was. And you can see that around 1960, we started spending a lot more money on fast food, and now that number has reached about 18% of total food spending. Another thing I'd like to remark is that back in 1889, or even in 2009, we're spending 51% of our money on food eaten at home, but a lot of that food is not simple home-cooked food. It's processed food that people are buying and bringing home. So I think this actually underestimates the magnitude of the change that's occurred in American food habits over this time period. So how about sugar? I think that's a pretty good marker of processed food intake. This is total sweetener intake from 1822 to 2005. In 1822, we consumed the amount of sugar in one 12-ounce can of cola every 5 days, whereas today we consume that same amount every 7 hours. And if you look at the changes in soft drink availability, from 1947 to 2005, there's been a 5-fold increase in soft drink consumption, so that accounts for a pretty good fraction of that increased sugar intake. I think potatoes are actually another place where we can really see these trends in action. If we look at total potato consumption, in the green here, it's increased modestly since 1960 to 2007, but if we break that down by fresh and processed potatoes, you can see that fresh potato consumption has declined by about 50% over that time period, whereas processed potatoes have increased by 4-fold just in the last 50 years. And if we do a ratio here, you can see that in 1960, processed potatoes were more than 75% of our total, were less than 25% of our total potato intake, whereas today, processed potatoes are almost 2/3 of our total potato intake. And that reflects primarily French fries and potato chips, if you're curious. There's been a major shift, major shift from a simple home-cooked diet to a diet that relies on processed foods professionally engineered for high palatability and high reward. But just how engineered are these foods? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the ingredients list for a Burger King strawberry milkshake. This is the base ingredients for the shake. All right, kind of scary, but we haven't added in the syrup yet. This is the strawberry syrup. Okay, pretty scary too, a lot of sugar. But what is this? Artificial flavor. Well, actually, the ingredients of artificial flavorings are proprietary, so they're not allowed to tell us what's in that. However, I did get my hands on some ingredients for what a typical artificial strawberry flavoring looks like, and it looks something like this. I had to shrink the font to fit it all on the screen. So there's a lot of scary things in here that I'm not real comfortable with, but that's beside the point. The point is that this is a highly engineered food designed to maximize palatability and reward and encourage repeat purchase and consumption behaviors. So we have this food system that's been highly engineered, but not only that, our very culture has been engineered. So there was a study a while back where they looked at which fictional characters are most highly recognized by children in the United States. The number one was Santa Claus. Number two was Ronald McDonald at 96%. And many of you may know that old Saint Nick himself has been peddling Coca-Cola since the 1930s. So let's go back to this graph here of calorie intake. We're eating more calories. Where are these extra calories coming from? Well, there was a group that tried to answer this question. This paper came out recently. They looked at the number of eating occasions over the years. So if you subtract 3 from their daily eating occasions, if you subtract 3 from their numbers, essentially gives you an estimate of how many times a day people are snacking. If we look at those figures, from 1977 to 2006, we went from less than 1 snack a day to nearly 2 snacks a day. They found that these increased snacking occasions accounted for the majority of the increase in calorie intake. And recall that these snack foods tend to be highly processed industrial foods, and sweetened beverages as well are included in that. So what are we going to do about it? Well, obesity is a complex problem. It involves many factors, and I don't want to be accused of oversimplifying it. But I believe that a major factor is that food that is professionally engineered to maximize palatability and reward value is uniquely fattening. And the solution is to avoid that food and eat a diet based on home-cooked, simple foods. So for people who are currently obese or overweight, they're going to require a more focused treatment strategy than someone who's currently lean. And I believe that moving toward an ancestral level of food palatability and reward and ancestral eating patterns may be helpful. And this is actually one of the places where I think the paleo diet really shines, because it reduces a lot of those reward factors while still providing a highly nutritious diet. So the first step, I think, should be to reduce the archetypal maximum reward foods. These are the foods that studies have shown people eat when they're binge eating or stress eating. Things like candy or chocolate, ice cream, chips, pastries, cookies, cake, fast food, and pizza. But in addition, oops, my animation's not working here, but in addition, I put together a series of steps of requiring progressively more discipline, but with potentially progressively more payoff to treat excess body fat using diet. So by reducing food reward and palatability. So at the bottom, the easiest step is to eat 3 or fewer meals per day, but no snacks. Next, cook food at home from simple, fresh ingredients. The next level is to restrict palatability and reward factors that were reduced or absent in the ancestral environment, such as high calorie. And now, I'm not saying that no ancestral diets had any of these factors, but the overall picture is one of overall reduced reward and palatability. So things like high calorie density, added sugars, added salt, free glutamate such as monosodium glutamate, added flavors, and added fats. And then the highest level would restrict variety as well, so you'd eat a few staple foods consistently with no flavorings added. So people can choose whichever level they feel is appropriate for their level of motivation and desired results. And this type of diet may appear daunting to people who are accustomed to a high palatability reward diet. However, keep in mind that there's nothing psychologically or physically necessary about the type of food that we eat today. And indeed, our own recent ancestors ate simpler food than we do today. Many cultures around the world have thrived on simple food throughout history, and simple food becomes more satisfying after a 1 to 2 week adjustment period. I'd like to thank a number of people who helped in me putting together this talk. In particular, Jeremy Landon helped me with some of the statistics on the US diet. Eric Schlosser wrote Fast Food Nation, which I drew from somewhat for this talk. Michel Cabanach and Anthony Sclafani did a lot of the fundamental research that was involved in these ideas. Seth Roberts helped by pointing me to the ideas of Michel Cabanach and Sclafani, and he wrote the book Shangri-La Diet. And Michael Schwartz is my current mentor at the University of Washington. So if you enjoyed this talk, come visit my blog at Whole Health Source at www.wholehealthsource.org. Thank you.
Plenty of time for questions. Use the microphone.
Is this on? No, it is on. Hi, I'm Gary Taubes. I'm going to give the next talk, but I didn't want to do this thing. You know, in a talk I'm not going to give today, Why We Get Fat, I give a lot of examples of populations with very high levels of obesity that were extremely poor. In some cases, there's a lot of malnutrition and subnutrition. Mothers are obese, children are starving and are not getting enough food to eat. It's hard to imagine that they had any kind of hyper-palatable food that was driving obesity, or that the mothers were in effect eating chocolate bars and Snickers bars that they could give their kids to stay alive. You know, beginning even with the Pima in 1902, who had high levels of obesity, particularly in the women, and had gone through 20 to 30 years of famine prior to that. How would your theory explain obesity in those populations, particularly obese mothers with starving, malnourished children?
Okay, well, I think to make any serious consideration of the reward value of a diet, you have to look at it in a considerable level of detail. But the Pima in particular, I mean, their diet went from one that was very low in sugar to very high in sugar. Sugar was one of their main sources of calories. And things like fry bread also became a major source of calories. So you're going from a more natural type of food base of beans and grains and squash to one that is more homogeneous, very easy to eat large amounts, has this combination of high calorie density, starch, and fat. Yeah.
Well, okay, then let's say we now have two hypotheses. One is that we add sugar to the diet, and again, these people, you know, there's a lot of malnutrition. If the mother's obese and the child's starving, we could assume that the mother isn't rewarding herself. But now we have another hypothesis, which is maybe the sugar and the refined carbohydrates in the diet changes the hormonal regulation of the fat tissue, a theory that I personally like a lot. You know, most of the observations you gave, even the non-palatable liquid diets would be diets that didn't have sugar in them, because if they had sugar in them, they'd be palatable. So we need an observation that could refute one of the two hypotheses. I would argue that
if it helps, the bland liquid diet in that initial study that I presented contained a fairly high proportion of sugar.
How was it bland then?
Well, it was bland compared to their typical diet. I didn't say it was completely lacking in reward factors.
Now the other populations, other like Mexican Americans in 1981, working on the, you know, Starr County, Texas, with one restaurant in town, in the county. Again, there's a lot of observations where you have to somehow imply that there's somehow the food has become more palatable. And in becoming more palatable, again, you're changing the nutrient composition. Even when you talk about the caloric increase, as you point out, you've changed the nutrient. Most of that caloric increase is carbohydrates and sugar, or high fructose corn syrup in particular.
Well, it depends on the group. Some had increases in carbohydrates, some had decreases, and they all saw increases in obesity. So I think that's a difficult supposition to defend. However, I mean, you know, I'm not claiming that reward is the only factor. I think it's an important factor. But, you know, again, to consider how the reward changed in any particular diet, I'd have to see it in detail. So I don't know how the diet of those Mexican populations that you're referring to changed. So I can't really speak to that.
Okay, I would just recommend in the future you should pay attention to populations that might refute your hypothesis rather than just present populations that support it. That's always key in science.
Thank you for the advice.
Hi, the name's Arvin. Actually, Gary stole my question, so I'm going to have to come up with another one. So, in your food reward series on the blog, you presented the 4 levels as you did here. And one particular question I have is, you made some comments regarding macronutrients and not restricting any macronutrients. So not so much focused on that, but you also made mention of the fact that combination of foods might increase the reward and palatability. So a safe starch like a baked potato is fine in isolation. The stick of butter is fine. When I combine the two, 1 + 1 = 3. So what is the physiological mechanism by which the combination of macronutrients is perhaps increasing the palatability?
Yeah, I mean, it's all happening in the brain. It's essentially orosensory processes. The brain is detecting the texture, the flavor, etc., and basing, as well as signals coming from the gastrointestinal tract. Those seem to be very important in determining reward value of foods. Those things are all coming together directly or indirectly in the reward centers of the brain, and a judgment is made based on those. Now, I don't want to act like all the reward factors have been worked out in detail. They haven't. There's still a tremendous amount to be learned about this. I think what we have now is a broad outline of what's going on.
Hi, my question is along the lines of appetite fatigue and specifically single foods. The U.S. Army's done some studies on survivability, people who are survivors that are literally stuck with one food in their diet for a period of time, and they get appetite fatigue. They get to the point where they will no longer eat even though they need the calories because they can't palate the food. Do you have any comments or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, variety is a major reward factor, and that's another thing that's changed in our diet. We have a tremendous amount of variety. Even if you look at the fruits and vegetables, things that are commonly considered to be healthy, we have access to many more fruits and vegetables all year round than we ever did, or at least affluent sectors of our society. So it's a major reward factor. And there are situations where you'd probably rather increase the reward value, such as maybe you're in a combat situation and you're burning a ton of calories, you're stressed out. So I mean, there are definitely situations where you would probably want to increase reward value, but I think for the average American, it's not that situation.
I think we should end it there so we can. Sure. If it's a quick one, it's a quick promise, a quick answer.
It's a practical question. Let's say I have two people who I recommend to read Full Health Source to lose weight, and one of them has had a diet that's not particularly palatable, and maybe they're not super overweight. Let's say a vegan, and their food doesn't taste awesome. And then I have somebody else who has a really highly palatable diet and eats a lot of bacon and Oreos and whatnot. If I want to give them a citation, a scientific source that says it will take 1 month or 2 months or whatever for them to lose whatever they've got up here that is making them attracted to hyperpalatable foods, then is there anything like that? Is there anything in the literature you read about brain stuff or trials where I can say it'll only take you 3 weeks, just stick with it? And does it differ between those two people because of the weight in their past diet?
Well, I mean, it's highly variable. I'm not quite clear on what your question is, but we can talk about it afterwards.
Thanks again to Dr. Stephen.